The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary clung to her black uniform, a ghost of the evening's labor. Clara moved through the cavernous marble hallway of the Croft residence with the practiced invisibility of service staff, her worn flats making no sound on the polished stone. Each step was a quiet rebellion against the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones, a familiar ache that started in her shoulders and radiated down to her heels. It was the kind of tired that came not just from a 12-hour shift on her feet, but from 3 years of shouldering everything alone. The weight of it all, Leo's school lunches, the perpetually overdue gas bill, the silent, gaping hole in their lives where David used to be, was a physical presence, a second skin she wore day in and day out. She was working on it. She told herself that every morning, a mantra whispered into the bathroom mirror as she braided her hair into a severe, practical knot. She was working on it. Tonight's event was a fundraiser for something noble and vague, the kind of cause wealthy people embraced with performative generosity. Clara's role, as a senior member of the catering team, was to oversee the flow of canapés and ensure no champagne flute remained empty for more than 30 seconds. It was a dance of deference and efficiency, one she had perfected. But now, as the last of the guests departed in a purr of luxury engines, a profound stillness descended upon the house. The other staff were in the main ballroom, breaking down tables. Clara had been tasked with a final sweep of the peripheral rooms for stray glasses. It was a task she welcomed, a few moments of solitude before the long bus ride home to the 2-bedroom apartment that felt both too small and too empty. Her life was a landscape of carefully managed constraints. Her budget was a tightrope walk, her time a currency she never had enough of, and her emotions a luxury she had packed away like old photographs. There was Leo, her 7-year-old son, the brilliant, burning sun at the center of her universe. For him, she maintained a facade of unwavering calm, a fortress of stability built on a foundation of sleepless nights and spreadsheets. He only knew the mother who could magically stretch a pound of ground beef into 3 distinct meals, the mother who never missed a parent-teacher conference, the mother whose smile was a constant, reassuring presence. He did not know the woman who lay awake at night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, her mind a frantic abacus calculating deficits that never seemed to shrink. The loneliness was a quiet hum, too, a background frequency she had learned to ignore most of the time. It only became sharp and piercing in moments like this, in the profound, opulent silence of a stranger's mansion. She pushed open a heavy oak door that had been left ajar, stepping into what appeared to be a private study. It was a world away from the glittering artifice of the ballroom. Here, the air smelled of old leather, paper, and faint, clean scent of ozone from the massive computer monitor sleeping on the desk. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with imposing, leather-bound volumes that looked as though they were for decoration, not for reading. The 4th wall was a sheet of glass overlooking a city that glittered like a spilled chest of jewels. It was a room that radiated a quiet, formidable power. It was the heart of the house, she suspected, the place where its owner, the reclusive magnate Julian Croft, actually lived. A single crystal tumbler holding a finger of amber liquid sat on a coaster next to a sleek, black laptop. She moved to retrieve it, her professional instincts overriding her sense of intrusion. And then she saw it. It was a photograph in a simple, elegant silver frame, positioned on the corner of the vast mahogany desk, angled toward the leather chair. It was not a family portrait, not a picture of a smiling wife or rosy-cheeked children. It was a photo of 2 men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting against a bright, unforgiving sun. They stood on the deck of a sailboat, the sea a brilliant, impossible blue behind them. One man was Julian Croft, younger, his face less severe, a genuine smile cracking the guarded facade she had glimpsed in business journals. The other man was David. Her David. Her late husband. He looked vibrant, alive, his familiar grin full of the easy, reckless confidence that had both captivated and ruined her. The air left Clara's lungs in a silent rush. The crystal tumbler in her hand felt impossibly heavy. The room tilted, the glittering city lights blurring into a smear of gold and white. It made no sense. David had known Julian Croft, yes, but he had spoken of him as a rival, a corporate shark who had circled his fledgling tech venture before it collapsed. He had painted Croft as the villain in the story of his failure, a convenient monolith of blame for the debts and the despair that had followed. He had never, not once, mentioned a friendship. He had certainly never mentioned a sailboat, or a day so bright it made them both look impossibly, carelessly happy. The photograph was a lie, or everything David had told her was a lie. Her mind, a place of order and careful ledgers, could not reconcile the two realities. A soft sound from the doorway made her flinch. Julian Croft stood there, his imposing frame filling the entrance. He had shed the tuxedo jacket from the party, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was taller than she had expected, his presence more grounded and less spectral than his reputation suggested. His eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, were fixed not on her, but on the photograph she was staring at. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply observed her, his expression unreadable, a mask of calm neutrality. She should have apologized, made an excuse, and fled the room. That was what protocol demanded. But the shock had short-circuited her professional deference. The question was a physical thing, rising from her chest and lodging in her throat, a jagged piece of glass she had to get out. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, alien to her own ears. "Why is my husband's photo in your house?" Julian Croft's gaze shifted from the photograph to her face. There was no anger in his eyes, only a flicker of something she could not name. Surprise, perhaps, but something deeper, more assessing. He took a slow step into the room, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken history. He looked at the uniform she wore, the name tag pinned neatly above her heart that read Clara, and a subtle shift occurred in his expression, a dawning of recognition. "You're Clara," he said. His voice was low and even, a quiet baritone that seemed to absorb the sound in the room. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as if he had been expecting her, or someone like her, for a very long time. Her grip tightened on the cool glass in her hand, the condensation cold against her skin. The photograph on the desk seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a captured moment of joy that now felt like a profound betrayal. She felt exposed, as if he could see right through the starched black fabric of her uniform to the tangled mess of her past, to the questions she had buried alongside her husband. She had come here to serve drinks and clear plates, a ghost in a machine of wealth. She had not expected to be confronted by a ghost of her own. She finally found her voice again, stronger this time, edged with a protective layer of defiance. "How do you know my name?" He moved further into the study, his steps silent and deliberate. He did not approach her directly, but walked over to the great glass window, placing his hands on the back of the leather chair that faced the city. He was a man who was comfortable with silence, who used it as a tool. Clara, whose life was filled with the constant noise of a small child and the clatter of kitchens, found it unnerving. She stood frozen, a service worker who had overstepped her bounds, a widow who had stumbled into a chapter of her husband's life she never knew existed. "I know your name because I knew David," he said, his gaze still fixed on the skyline. "He was my partner. And he was my friend." The words landed in the quiet room with the force of stones dropped into a still pond. Partner. Friend. These were simple words, but they shattered the entire narrative of Clara's grief. David's narrative had been one of a lone genius battling corporate behemoths. He had been Icarus, flying too close to the sun. In his telling, Julian Croft was the sun, impersonal, scorching, destructive. But this photograph, this quiet admission, suggested a different story entirely. It suggested a shared flight. He turned from the window then, and his eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw past the formidable reputation and the immense wealth. She saw a flicker of the man in the photograph, a weariness around his eyes that the expensive suit and confident posture could not entirely conceal. There was a loneliness in this room that mirrored her own, though his was insulated by marble and glass, and hers by thin drywall and the sound of neighbors arguing. "He lied to me," she said, the realization coming out as a flat, dead statement. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She was not speaking to Julian Croft, the billionaire. She was speaking into the void, giving voice to a suspicion she had long held but never dared to examine. David had been a weaver of beautiful stories, and she had wanted so badly to believe them. Julian nodded slowly, a gesture of solemn confirmation. It wasn't a triumphant gesture, but a sad one. "He lied to a lot of people," he said. "Including himself." He looked at the tumbler in her hand. "You can put that down. You're not staff anymore. Not tonight." The command was gentle but firm. It broke the spell of her professional role. She placed the glass on a nearby side table, her hand trembling slightly. She was no longer just Clara the caterer. In this room, she was David's widow, and that gave her a strange, unsought-after status. She felt a surge of anger, hot and clarifying, cutting through the shock. "Why is it still here?" she asked, gesturing toward the photograph. "If he lied to you, if he was your partner in a venture that failed so spectacularly, why would you keep a picture of him on your desk?" It was a direct, impertinent question. A week ago, she would never have dreamed of speaking with such audacity to a man of his stature. But the neat, ordered columns of her life had just been thrown into disarray. The rules no longer seemed to apply. He regarded her for a long moment, his head tilted slightly. He seemed to be assessing her, not her appearance, but her substance. He was looking at the woman who had survived the wreckage David had left behind. "I keep it as a reminder," he said, his voice quiet. "A reminder of what can happen when you trust the wrong person. And a reminder that, before it all went wrong, the idea was good. The friendship was real." There was a profound sense of loss in his words, an echo of her own grief, but for something different. She had mourned a man. He had mourned a friendship and a dream. She saw the duality of him then, the man the world saw, the powerful, decisive billionaire, and the man who stood in his quiet study, keeping vigil over a photograph that represented both a betrayal and a cherished memory. He was more complex than the caricature David had created. "I've followed your progress," he added, his directness almost startling. "After the collapse. After he was gone. You paid back every one of the private investors he'd borrowed from. The ones the bankruptcy didn't cover. You sold your house. You took on 2 jobs. You did it all yourself." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. He had been watching her. The knowledge was both invasive and, in a strange way, validating. Her struggle had been invisible to the world, a private, grinding war of attrition fought in bank queues and late-night bookkeeping sessions. To know that someone, especially this man, had seen it, had noted her quiet, stubborn integrity, was deeply unsettling. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you care?" "Because integrity is a rare commodity," he answered simply. "And I felt a certain responsibility. The company that failed, it was our company. His name was on the letterhead, but my capital was behind it. His failure was also mine." This was the moment. The room seemed to contract, the air growing thick with unspoken possibilities. He was not just a man from her husband's past, he was a potential force in her future. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, a tectonic plate moving for the first time in 3 years. He walked over to his desk, but instead of sitting in the large leather chair, he leaned against the front of it, creating a sense of parity between them. It was a subtle, deliberate gesture of respect. "The official story is that David was a poor businessman who overextended himself," he began, his tone shifting, becoming more focused, more intense. "The company ran out of money, and the pressure led to his accident. That is the neat, simple version. I have never believed it." Clara's heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs. David's death had been ruled an accident. A single-car crash on a rain-slicked road late at night. She had accepted it because she had to. To question it was to descend into a rabbit hole of what-ifs that she could not afford to entertain. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the numbers never added up," he said, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "There was money missing. Significant amounts of money. Not embezzled in a traditional sense, but redirected. It was clever. It was almost untraceable. I've had the best forensic accountants in the country look at the books. They found the anomalies, but they could never find the end point. They were missing the context." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Clara felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. She had spent the last 3 years cleaning up the financial mess David had left, a mess of credit card debt and personal loans. She had assumed it was all part of his failed business. The idea that there was a deeper, more sinister layer to it was terrifying. "What context?" she whispered. "You," he said. He didn't mean it in a personal, romantic way. He meant her as a key, a piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. David's personal life. His habits. The small details that a corporate accountant would never know. "I think David was hiding something. And I think that whatever he was hiding is the key to where the money went." He straightened up from the desk and walked over to a section of the bookshelf. He pressed a panel, and a section of books swung inward, revealing a small, climate-controlled vault. From it, he pulled out a heavy, black ledger box. He placed it on the polished surface of his desk with a soft, definitive thud. "These are the complete project files," he said. "The raw data. Every transaction, every email, every internal memo. I want you to look at them." Clara stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. "Me. I'm a caterer. I do freelance bookkeeping for small businesses on the side. I'm not a forensic accountant." "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You're not. You're better. You're meticulous. You're principled. I know because I saw how you handled David's personal debts. More importantly, you knew him. You might see a pattern, a name, a date, that means nothing to anyone else, but everything to you. It was an offer. A strange, unconventional job proposal delivered in the dead of night, born from a ghost in a silver frame. It was a terrifying proposition, to willingly dive back into the most painful chapter of her life, to sift through the digital remains of the men she had loved, the men who had so thoroughly deceived her. Her first instinct, the one honed by years of self-preservation, was to say no. To thank him, walk away, and go back to her life of manageable hardship. It was safe there. She knew the rules. But then she thought of Leo. She thought of the worn-out soles of his sneakers, the field trips she couldn't afford to send him on, the constant, grinding anxiety that was her companion. The money Julian Croft could offer would be life-changing. It would mean security. It would mean breathing room. More than that, though, there was the question. The one that had been sparked by the photograph. The need to know the truth. For 3 years, she had been cleaning up the consequences of David's actions. Now, she was being offered a chance to understand them. She looked from the black box to Julian Croft's steady, waiting eyes. He wasn't pitying her. He was offering her a position of strength, a role that her unique, painful experience had qualified her for. He was seeing a value in her that she had forgotten she possessed. It was a flicker of hope, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Her caution warred with a desperate need for answers, for a final closing of a ledger that had been open for far too long. "What are the terms?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of victory, but of respect. He had seen the steel in her, and he had been right. "You'll have a private office at my corporate headquarters," he said, outlining the details with brisk efficiency. "Full access to all our resources. And you will be paid a consulting fee that will make your current financial burdens a distant memory. Your only job will be to find the truth. Whatever it is." She took a deep breath, the scent of leather and old paper filling her lungs. It felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, trusting that something, or someone, would catch her. She was tired of being a victim of her husband's past. It was time to become its investigator. "I'll do it," she said. The decision hung in the air, a turning point marked not by a handshake, but by a quiet, mutual understanding. She was no longer just Clara, the single mother, the caterer. She had accepted a new role, stepping into a world of wealth and secrets she could barely imagine. It was a transition from a life of passive survival to one of active pursuit. The path forward was uncertain and fraught with the potential for more pain, but for the first time in years, it was a path of her own choosing. The first day felt like an elaborate dream. A black car, sent by Mr. Croft, picked her up from her modest apartment building, the gleaming vehicle an alien presence on the street of aging sedans and minivans. Leo had watched from the window, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Clara had knelt down, straightened his collar, and explained it was for a new, temporary job, a special project helping a man her father used to know. She focused on the practicalities, the tangible details, because the emotional reality of what she was doing was too vast to comprehend. She was going to dissect her dead husband's life, piece by piece, under the employment of the men he had called an enemy. The Croft Enterprises building was a shard of glass and steel that pierced the downtown sky. The lobby was a cathedral of minimalist design, all white marble and hushed efficiency. A woman with a sleek black dress and an equally sleek smile greeted her by name, handing her an access card without her having to ask. The elevator ascended with a silent, stomach-lurching speed. She was led to an office on the 42nd floor. It was not a cubicle. It was a corner office with a view that mirrored the one from Julian's study, a god's-eye perspective of the sprawling city. A new laptop sat on the expansive desk, alongside the heavy, black ledger box from the night before. It was all real. For the first week, she saw Julian only in passing. A nod in the hallway, a brief glimpse of him in a glass-walled conference room, surrounded by people in expensive suits. She kept her head down, immersing herself in the digital archive. It was emotionally grueling work. She opened files filled with David's familiar turns of phrase, his optimistic projections, his casual lies. Each email was a small ghost, each spreadsheet a map of his deceptions. She worked with a methodical, detached focus, channeling her grief and confusion into the task. She created charts, cross-referenced timelines, and built a color-coded system to track the flow of money. She was good at this. She found a grim satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos that had once consumed her life. One evening, she was working late, staring at a complex wire transfer diagram until her eyes burned. The patterns were there, just out of focus, like a word on the tip of her tongue. There was a soft knock on her open door. Julian stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing one on the corner of her desk, careful not to disturb her papers. She murmured her thanks, her mind still lost in a web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. "Find anything?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, his presence filling the quiet space. "Anomalies," she said, rubbing her tired eyes. "A series of payments to a consulting firm in the Cayman Islands. A firm that seems to exist only on paper. The payments are small at first, then they escalate. They start about 6 months before the company went under." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The accountants found that. But they couldn't link it to anyone." "I know," she said. "But the dates are what's interesting." She turned her monitor toward him. The first payment was made on October 12th. That was Leo's birthday. The second was on November 23rd. Our anniversary. They're all on dates that were significant to us. It's like he was using them as a private calendar. A reminder. Julian looked at the screen, then back at her. His gaze was intense, appreciative. "That's what they were missing," he said softly. "The context. That's why you're here." In that small moment, a quiet rapport began to form between them. It was not built on flirtation or romance, but on a shared purpose and a mutual, growing respect. He saw her not as a damsel in distress, but as a skilled professional, an indispensable partner in his quest for the truth. And she began to see him not as a reclusive billionaire, but as a man burdened by a betrayal that had clearly cut him to the core. They were 2 people connected by the long shadow of a man they had both, in their own ways, loved and lost. The dynamic shifted further a few weeks later. Leo's after-school care program closed unexpectedly for a plumbing emergency, and Clara had no choice but to bring him to the office for the last hour of her day. She was mortified, convinced she was breaking some unwritten rule of corporate decorum. She set him up in a corner with his sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, begging him to be as quiet as a mouse. Julian found them that way. He walked in, his expression unreadable, and Clara's apology died on her lips. He didn't look at her. He looked at Leo. Her son was hunched over his paper, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to draw a particularly complex dinosaur. "Is that a Spinosaurus?" Julian asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Leo looked up, his eyes wide. He nodded, clutching his green pencil. "It's the biggest meat-eating dinosaur ever," Leo said with the solemn authority of a 7-year-old expert. "Bigger than a T-Rex." "I know," Julian said, crouching down so he was at eye level with the boy. "The sail on its back is tricky, isn't it? You have to get the curve just right." He spent the next 20 minutes sitting on the floor with her son, not talking about business or money, but about the precise skeletal structure of prehistoric reptiles. Clara watched them, a strange ache in her chest. She was used to seeing men be awkward or dismissive around her son. But Julian was different. He was present. He listened to Leo with a focused intensity that made the little boy puff up with pride. Later, after Leo was gone, picked up by a friend's mother, Julian lingered at her doorway. "He's a good kid," he said. "You've done a great job with him." It was a simple compliment, but it struck her with profound force. It was an acknowledgement of the most important and difficult work she did, the work that happened far away from spreadsheets and balance sheets. It was that night he finally told her about his own past. They were the only two left on the floor, the city lights a silent, glittering audience outside the window. He spoke of his father, a cold and demanding man who had viewed affection as a weakness and success as the only measure of a man's worth. He spoke of his own solitary childhood, of the immense pressure to build upon the family empire. David was the first real friend I ever made who didn't want something from me, he said, his voice low, his gaze distant. He didn't care about the Croft name. He just cared about the ideas, the energy. We were going to change the world with that company. He made me believe in something beyond balance sheets. Clara listened, her heart aching for the lonely boy he had been, and for the men whose capacity for trust had been so thoroughly shattered. When he betrayed me, he continued, it wasn't just about the money. He destroyed the only partnership I ever valued. He proved my father right. That's a difficult thing to forgive. This revelation was a turning point. It leveled the field between them. He was no longer just her powerful, enigmatic employer. He was Julian, a man who had also been wounded, who was also searching for a way to make sense of the past. His vulnerability was an invitation, a quiet offering of trust. And Clara, who had kept her own heart under lock and key for 3 years, found herself wanting to accept it. The connection deepening between them was no longer just about a shared investigation, it was becoming something quieter, more personal, and infinitely more fragile. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. It was hidden in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Invoices, buried 3 subfolders deep in an archived server drive. It was a scanned receipt for a storage unit, rented under a name Clara didn't recognize. The rental had been paid in cash, a year in advance. The date on the receipt was 2 days before David's accident. It was a loose thread, almost nothing, but her instincts screamed at her. She spent the next hour cross-referencing the rental company's address with David's old GPS data, which she had painstakingly recovered from a corrupted hard drive. There was a match. A single trip, late at night, to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. She brought it to Julian immediately. He looked at the data, his expression hardening with focus. He made a single phone call, his voice low and authoritative. Within the hour, they had a court order. They drove to the storage facility together, the silence in his car charged with anticipation. The place was a desolate landscape of corrugated steel and faded paint. A grizzled manager, intimidated by Julian's presence and the official document, led them to the unit and cut the lock. The air that rushed out was stale and smelled of dust. The unit was almost empty. There were a few boxes of old files, a dusty computer tower, and a small, locked briefcase. Julian lifted the briefcase onto the hood of his car. It was the kind lawyers used, old-fashioned and made of worn leather. He pried it open with a tire iron from his trunk. Inside was a second ledger. Not a digital one, but a physical, handwritten book. And next to it, a series of audio tapes. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the ledger. The handwriting was David's. But the entries were not about business expenses. They detailed payments, dates, and meeting locations. It was a blackmail ledger. At the top of the first page was a name, Marcus Thorne. Clara knew the name. Marcus Thorne had been the chief operating officer of their company, a man David had spoken of with a mixture of admiration and fear. Julian picked up one of the tapes. He had a portable cassette player in his car's emergency kit, a strange, analog relic in his digital world. He slid the tape in and pressed play. A voice filled the air, distorted and tinny, but unmistakable. It was Marcus Thorne. The tape was a recording of a conversation, with Thorne's voice clear and David's a muffled, desperate murmur. Thorne was threatening to expose a mistake David had made years earlier, a corner he had cut on a patent application for his first solo venture, long before he met Julian. It wasn't illegal, but it was an ethical breach that would have destroyed his reputation. It all became sickeningly clear. David hadn't been a thief. He had been a victim. The money he had siphoned, the money he had marked with the dates of their anniversaries and Leo's birthdays, was not for himself. It was blackmail money, paid to Marcus Thorne. He had been trapped, trying to protect his reputation and the company, and had dug himself into a hole he couldn't escape. The failed venture wasn't just a failure. It had been systematically bled dry. Suddenly, a car screeched into the facility, parking aggressively to block their exit. Marcus Thorne got out. He must have had a silent alarm on the unit. He was a large man, his expensive suit stretched tight over a bulky frame. His face was a mask of fury. "You shouldn't have come here," he snarled, his eyes fixed on the open briefcase. "That's private property." Julian stepped in front of Clara, a protective, instinctual movement. "We have a court order, Marcus. It's over." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's never over." He took a menacing step forward. "You have no idea what you're messing with. Give me the case." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The abstract threat on a spreadsheet had become a physical reality. She looked at Julian. His face was calm, his posture relaxed, but she saw the tension coiled in his shoulders. He was ready. But she knew this couldn't be solved with a physical confrontation. It had to be solved with the truth. Her mind, sharpened by weeks of intense focus, raced. She remembered an email, a seemingly innocuous one from David to Thorne, sent the day before the accident. The subject line was, "Final proposal." At the time, she had assumed it was business. Now, she understood. David had been planning to expose him. He had gathered the evidence, the ledger, the tapes, and was going to go to the authorities. His death was no accident. He was going to confess, she said, her voice cutting through the tense standoff. Both of them turned to look at her. "He was going to turn you in, and himself. He recorded everything. It's all here. We know everything, Marcus." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. She saw the flicker of panic in Thorne's eyes. He had assumed David's evidence had died with him. In that moment of hesitation, Julian's phone, which he had discreetly activated, captured every word. The silent call to his head of security was transmitting everything. Julian saw the shift in Thorne's demeanor and pressed the advantage. He didn't fight him with his fists, he fought him with facts. He laid out the wire transfers, the shell corporations, the exact dates and amounts Clara had uncovered. He spoke with the cold, irrefutable logic of a man who held all the cards. Thorne's bluster crumbled, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal fear. The arrival of security, followed by the police Julian had alerted, was almost an anticlimax. The confrontation was over. Driving back to the city, the adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving Clara feeling hollow and shaky. She had the truth. David was not the villain she had started to believe him to be, but a flawed, tragic man who had made a terrible mistake and paid the ultimate price. It was a painful, complicated kind of closure. Julian pulled the car over to a scenic lookout, the city spread below them like a blanket of stars. He turned off the engine, and the silence was profound. "You were incredible back there," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "You saw the whole picture. You were brave." "I was terrified," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," he said. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it." He reached across the console, his hand gently covering hers. His touch was warm, steadying. "You solved it, Clara. I've had the best minds working on this for years, but you were the one who solved it." The case was resolved with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. Marcus Thorne was arrested, and the full scope of his extortion came to light. The news cleared David's name, reframing him in the public eye from a failed entrepreneur to a tragic victim. For Clara, it brought a kind of peace. It didn't erase the lies or the pain, but it recontextualized them. It allowed her to finally mourn the men she had loved, flaws and all, without the anger and resentment that had clouded her grief. A week later, Julian called her into his main office. Not her temporary one, but his own, the vast room with the view and the photograph that had started everything. The ledger box was gone from his desk. In its place was a simple, thick envelope with her name on it. "Your final payment," he said. "And a bonus. For services that went far beyond the scope of our agreement." She knew it was a life-altering amount of money. Enough to buy a small house, to start a college fund for Leo, to finally, truly be free from the financial anxiety that had been her constant companion. She took the envelope, her hand steady now. "Thank you," she said. "For everything. For trusting me." He shook his head. "Thank you, Clara. You gave me back a piece of my past I thought was lost forever. You brought order to the chaos. He paused, his gaze direct and serious. His next words were not those of an employer to an employee. They were from a man to a woman. The project is over, he said. But I find I'm not ready for our partnership to end. Have dinner with me. Not as a consultant. Not as my friend's widow. Just as Clara. And I'll be just Julian. Hope, cautious and fragile, bloomed in her chest. For 3 years, her life had been about endings. The end of her marriage, the end of her financial stability, the end of her dreams. For the first time, she was being offered a new beginning. A real one. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his eyes, at the hint of a genuine smile on his lips, and she knew her answer. I would like that very much. 6 months later, the scent of roasting chicken, not garlic and rosemary, filled Clara's own kitchen. It was a small kitchen in a small, rented house with a big backyard, the kind of place she had only dreamed of. The perpetually overdue gas bill was a ghost of a memory, replaced by the quiet hum of a new, energy-efficient furnace. There were no more spreadsheets taped to the refrigerator, only Leo's colorful drawings of dinosaurs and rocket ships. Her life was no longer a tightrope walk, it was a path, wide and open and stretching into a future that felt bright with possibility. She had a new job, a permanent position as the head of a new charitable foundation Julian had established. She was in charge of vetting small, innovative nonprofits, finding the integrity in their ledgers, a skill she had honed in the most personal way imaginable. It was work that had meaning, work that used her unique talents to build something good in the world. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. The true measure of her new reality, however, was not in her bank account or her job title. It was in the quiet, ordinary moments. It was in the sound of Leo's laughter as he chased a soccer ball in the backyard with Julian. It was in the comfortable silence that could fall between her and Julian as they cooked dinner together, a dance of easy familiarity that felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture. They were taking it slow, building something real on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. He had met her at her most broken, and she had met him at his most guarded. Together, they had untangled a painful past, and in doing so, had forged a bond that was both resilient and deeply tender. He was a man who saw her, truly saw her, her strength, her intelligence, her quiet determination. And she, in turn, saw the men behind the billions, the men who could talk about dinosaurs with a 7-year-old with the same passion he discussed market futures, the men whose rare, genuine smile could light up his entire face. Tonight, after dinner, the three of them sat on the living room floor around a large coffee table. Spread across it was a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, a complex landscape of a serene Japanese garden. It was their current project. Leo, with his sharp eyes, was in charge of finding all the edge pieces. Clara was methodically sorting the colors, bringing order to the chaos of shapes. Julian, with a surprising patience, was tackling the most difficult section, a vast expanse of blue sky that looked maddeningly uniform. He fit a piece into the sky, a small, satisfying click. There, he said, a note of triumph in his voice. One more down. Only 500 to go. Leo giggled, fitting a corner piece into place. We're going to finish it, he declared with absolute certainty. Yes, we are, Clara said, her heart full. She looked at the two of them, her son and the men she was falling in love with, their heads bent together in shared concentration under the warm glow of the lamp. The puzzle was a perfect metaphor for her life. It had been a scattered, chaotic mess of pieces that didn't seem to fit, defined by a huge, gaping hole in the middle. But slowly, with patience and trust and the help of an unexpected hand, the picture was coming together. It wasn't the picture she had originally planned, but it was beautiful and whole and real. She picked up a piece of the puzzle, its odd shape feeling solid and sure in her hand. She remembered standing in that cold, marble hallway, an invisible woman exhausted by the weight of her life. She thought of the silver-framed photograph, the ghost from the past that had, against all odds, led her here. It had been an ending that held a hidden beginning. A single question, whispered in a room of power and secrets, had changed everything. It had not led to a fairy tale, but to something far better. An earned happiness, quiet and sustainable, pieced together, one small, perfect fit at a time.